Hello my lovers of horror, and today I'm going to be reacting to another video from Don't Scare Claire, and it is called Evil Paranormal Presence in the Edinburgh Vaults. Okay guys, if you haven't already, please go and subscribe and check out Don't Scare Claire's videos. I will leave a link to her channel and the link to the video that I am reacting to. Okay guys. Sorry guys, they're gonna be in the description down below. Sorry. Okay guys, let's get straight into the video.
A trip to Edinburgh is complete without at least one ghost tour, with the vaults below the South Bridge being one of the most popular excursions for tourists with a taste of the darker side of history. But as you move from room to room, listening to stories of the past and, of course, tales of the previous ghostly encounters from tour groups that came before you, those accounts might start to feel increasingly real. And then suddenly, you're not just a visitor who's on a tour down in the Edinburgh vaults, but you could very well become the frightened witness of a paranormal encounter, seeing something so terrifying, so unexplainable, that the tour guide will include your story in their repertoire to chill the spines of future groups.
Go and subscribe to Don't Scare Claire, guys. Let's get her more subscribers, please.
So before we go down underground, let's talk a little bit about Edinburgh itself and how the bridge came to be. Because Edinburgh actually sits on a really hilly area. There are like 7 hills that Edinburgh kind of sits between. Everywhere you walk in the city, it's uphill, is one of those places. But back in the day, as the city was expanding over these hills, they made use of all the space that they could. In 1785, they started building the South Bridge to connect the Old Town High Street to the university buildings to the south. And this South Bridge was huge. It was 1,000 foot long and made up of 19 archways. When the bridge opened in 1788 though, it was not super well received by the locals. As they were planning the grand opening ceremony, it was agreed that the first person to cross the bridge should be significant. And so the elderly wife of a local judge was put forward to be the first person to cross the new South Bridge. Thing was, she actually passed away in the week before the bridge opened. The officials couldn't go back on their word though. Contracts had been signed, hands had been shaken, a promise was a promise, and this lady was the first person to use the bridge. Just in a coffin in the back of a horse-drawn hearse. Naturally, everyone then thought, absolutely 100%, you've just cursed that bridge, and so loads of locals refused to use it for several years. Time passed on though, Edinburgh continued to grow, and they still needed more space, and eventually buildings were cropping up either side of the bridge, effectively blocking off most of those 19 archways. And that in itself, well, that presented an opportunity. They had all this space under the bridge, which was now completely enclosed by the bridge itself, and then the buildings either side of it. So in those archways, they put in floors and ceilings and created about 120 vaults. And so this is where the kind of misconception, kind of half-truth came about that Edinburgh had an underground city. It wasn't a thriving metropolis of mole people living underground. It was spaces like this, which before they had been enclosed, were above ground. But now that there were buildings either side of the bridge arches and there were buildings on top of the bridge, it now felt like you had to go downstairs to get into these vaults. So it was like you were going underground into a subterranean city. And so after all of these buildings had been built and the vaults had been created, to look at the area, you wouldn't think that there was a bridge there. Like, you can't see a bridge. It's only if you go onto the Cowgate that you'll see one of the arches still open. And if you were actually on the bridge back in the 18th century, all you would see is a street of quite high-class, fashionable shops. Things like silversmiths, goldsmiths, bookbinders, like those very high-class establishments. But then if you made your way down into the vaults, I guess it really would feel like an underground city, because those vaults were rented out as storerooms for the shops above, as well as actual workshops. People did run their businesses from these vaults. Legitimate businesses like tanners, butchers, cobblers, blacksmiths, like all those sorts of...
Oh, sorry guys, yeah. And I've seen paranormal investigators YouTube videos, them going down into the vaults, and like what Don't Scare Claire is saying is true. And I would like to know your thoughts down below, guys. I know this is completely off the topic of the video, but what do you guys think of? Do you believe every paranormal YouTuber on YouTube? See, like, we want to believe, and we all have paranormal experiences. That is true of itself. But then, like, when you find something like them, kind of like having like strings and like, you know, seeing like somebody in the background, you know, or like seeing someone pushing or like pulling the string, if you guys really want a really good channel, a debunking channel, please go and watch hold on a second, guys. Isn't it Beetle Get Scared, Claire, isn't it? Oh, so guys, please go and check out Beetle Gets Scared. He's a really good debunker and he really does believe in the paranormal. Okay, guys, let's get back to the video.
Of people. As over the first 30 years, it worked great, but there was a problem with the construction of these vaults because they hadn't actually been waterproofed properly. Apparently they'd been built with cheap materials, so they leaked, which with the amount it rains in Edinburgh is not ideal. But I'm not just talking about seeping in a little bit of rainwater. Oh no, because I talked about it a little when we covered Mary King's Close, which is another now underground area of the city. This was not the cleanest of places. Obviously you're using horses as your main mode of transport at the time, so you've got horse poop on the street. But more importantly, there is no sewage system. Literal human waste would be thrown out of the windows after you'd shouted "Gardy Loo" to hopefully give anyone walking below you time to get the heck out of the way before you throw a bucket of nastiness all over their head. And so you've got all of that over the streets, and then the rainwater, which is washing it down the little cracks and into the South Bridge vaults. Within a couple of decades, the vaults had all been abandoned by these legitimate businesses. They were useless as storerooms, as anything you stored in there was going to get covered in said nastiness. And come on, who wants to buy their meat from the butcher who operates out of what is effectively now a rat-infested, disease-ridden slum? They were poorly ventilated, with obviously no natural light, and quite often flooded, with water that contained things that was probably best not to think about. But one man's hovel is another man's castle, and at the end of the day, this was still a roof over your head. It was still better than trying to survive out on the streets in the depths of winter. So as the businesses moved out, the poorest of the poor moved in. And it wasn't like they really had a choice. Edinburgh was still growing, people were still moving to the city looking for work, and these people just couldn't afford to rent a tenement house above ground. And to even build the bridge, they'd had to demolish 3 closes, Nidgery, Marlin and Peebles Wines, which were already known as very poor areas, like the poor had already lost the housing there. And so from this time period on, we don't really have that many official records, and that's because most of these people were squatting illegally, having something like up to 25-30 people living in one of these vaults alone. These dirty, rat-infested vaults where raw sewage was seeping through the ceiling. So it's no surprise that I saw one quote where it said that the life expectancy was something like 13 months. And that was because it wasn't just the disease that could get you. Because naturally, a dark, pretty much underground warren of nooks and crannies, in a place where only the most destitute would be forced to go, which also happened to be a place where city guards turned a blind eye, was the perfect sanctuary for criminals. And it's thought that from about the 1820s-ish onwards, obviously there are no records, gangs of criminals, thieves, murderers, illegal taverns, gambling dens, brothels, they all gradually moved into the Southbridge vaults to operate in the darkness. There was also talk of body snatchers using the vaults to hide their freshly dug up corpses until they could get them to the medical schools. Because in case you didn't know, there was a real problem for Edinburgh in the 1800s, specifically again around the 1820s. Because Edinburgh was at the forefront of medicine around the time, its medical schools were highly regarded. So if you wanted to train to be a doctor, Edinburgh was where you would go to learn from the best of the best. But to train...
Right, here I don't get, guys, right? Why the heck would someone want to go into a graveyard and dig up a dead body? Like, dude. Exactly. And the thing is, guys, when I'm no longer on this earth, I don't want somebody digging up my fucking grave and go and hunt their asses, bro. Do you mean? It's common decency and respect for those who are no longer with us. Well, maybe they do, but maybe some people do get the bodies because, like, oh, I don't be testing these medicines on humans. Nobody wants you going into their granny's grave and taking her either, dude. Okay? Great. Back to the video.
Train all of these doctors, the medical schools needed a constant supply of cadavers for students to practice on, to learn anatomy and whatnot. And at the time, the only cadavers that were above board, were fair game for the medical schools, were those of criminals. But the demand was higher than that supply. And so a gap in the market opened up that body snatchers, grave robbers, or resurrectionists, whichever name you prefer, were only too happy to fill. And of course, the doctors were rather inclined not to ask too many questions, as they got what they wanted out of the deal. A fresh corpse could fetch you £8 in the summer when the body body would decay quickly, so it wouldn't be as useful for as long, or up to 10 pounds in the winter when it was cold enough so that they could store bodies for longer and perform more dissections. And at the time, a labourer would have been doing well if he'd made £1 a week, so it was a pretty lucrative industry to get into if you could stomach it. And so during the 1820s, these grave robbers clearly have no scruples if they're digging up grandma for a few quid, right?
Exactly.
And you'd think, oh, some of these loved ones, they would have been buried with jewellery, fine clothes, so that's a nice little income stream too, isn't it? These body snatchers, though, they lacked morals, not brains, because theft was obviously very illegal, and if they were caught with their pockets full of gold jewellery or whatever else looked valuable, they'd probably hang for it. So they actually left all the corpse's personal items in the grave. Because carrying around a dead body, that's still illegal, but it was a bit of a murky grey area in the law, and so they actually likely wouldn't hang for that. So that's just an interesting little mental image for you. The grave robbers would be carrying around naked corpses, so they couldn't be done for the capital crime of theft. And so it was around this time in Edinburgh's history that two infamous serial killers, Burke and Hare, were prowling around looking for their next soon-to-be corpse that they could sell. And if you don't know who these guys are, William Burke and William Hare were responsible for 16 murders, spanning from November 1827 to October 1828. And they'd sell these bodies to a Dr. Robert Knox, who was a lecturer in anatomy. So he didn't really mind where the bodies came from. So there's no solid evidence that Burke and Hare did operate down in the vaults, if they hid bodies or chose victims or anything like that down there. But because they were operating around the time when the vaults had this really shady reputation, it's not beyond the realms of imagination to think that they may have ventured down there once or twice. And again, because these vaults were kind of officially abandoned and technically no one should have been living and working down there aren't many official records of what exactly went on down in the vaults. But with the type of people who were down there, the poor that no one cared about and the criminals that weren't exactly going to write down their incriminating activities, it's pretty safe to assume that probably a lot of people died down here during this time, but we just don't know the scale of it. But there are some cases that we do know about, like in 1823. A woman called Mary McKinnon is described as a tavern landlady / lodging house keeper, and her official address is 82 Southbridge. But reading between the lines, it's likely that her quote-unquote tavern was probably actually a brothel operating within one of the vaults. On the 8th of February 1823, Mary is out having a drink with a friend when she gets word that she needs to go back to her tavern immediately. She gets back there and there are a group of men, obviously quite drunk, they've gotten quite rowdy, but now it was turning violent, they'd broken some furniture. Mary grabs a knife to try and intimidate the men into leaving her establishment, but things just get more chaotic, and in the frenzy, she ends up stabbing one of these men, a clerk called William Mowat. He's taken to the infirmary, and while he's there, accuses Mary of being the one to stab him. 12 days later, on the 20th of February, William would die of his injuries. And Mary, she's found guilty of murder, hanged, and her body is donated to doctors for a public dissection. But that's just one of the cases that we know about. The fact is that these vaults were incredibly dangerous places to live and work, and it's likely that a lot of murder happened down here which will never be solved. And it wasn't just criminals and disease either. Some of these vaults had fireplaces, which obviously meant chimneys, which also meant the need for chimney sweeps. But the structure of some of these chimneys wasn't uniform, and apparently sometimes these children would get stuck and die in the chimneys.
No.
And we only know that because there was one chimney that was excavated, and apparently they found bone fragments from a kid who would have been between 7 and 12 years old up in the chimney. And if all of that didn't kill you, the disease, the murderers, the occupational hazards, even just plain starving to death because you were so poor, in 1824, the Great Fire of Edinburgh, which started on the 15th of November and lasted for around 5 days, that could be bad news for you too. Officially, the death toll was 13, but it's thought that loads more died down in the vaults. And this was because of where the fire was. The Tron Kirk, which sat right above the vaults, that had caught fire. And so thick black smoke had begun again seeping down into the vaults. If the smoke got to you, you'd be killed within minutes, but that was a nicer way to go. It's been talked about online that because the fire was so intense above these people in the vaults, it heated up all the stones going down the bridge, and each vault acted like a baker's oven, effectively cooking you alive if you couldn't get out. But like I say, no official records, no hard evidence of how many, if any, died in the vaults during the fire. We just don't know. So I think I can say with some degree of certainty that the Southbridge Vaults was not a place you wanted to find yourself in the 1800s. That is, until the 1860s, 1870s kind of time, because the vaults were then actually filled in with rubble to block it off from all the squatters and criminals. And there the vaults sat, blocked off, bricked up and forgotten about, until 1985 when the international rugby union player, Norrie Rowan, stumbled across a blocked passageway. He started digging and digging and digging, one bucket at a time, and uncovered the forgotten vaults after over 100 years. And it's from these excavations that we know about the people that lived and worked down there, as they found things like toys, medicine bottles, clay pipes, even horseshoes from the blacksmiths. Now, Nowadays, some of the vaults have been turned into bars and clubs and things, and since 1996 there have been tour companies that now give both history and ghost tours of the vaults. And not surprisingly, both the guides and the visitors very commonly experience something that they cannot explain. And I'm talking almost immediately after the vaults opened up, people reported weird things happening. And the activity was happening everywhere, but there seems to be certain...
Oh, sorry. It's like when somebody moves in, say you move into like a new house and it needs a lot of work, and then you start to renovate that house and you start to change that house. If any spirits are there or that are, in the darkness, you're going to pay them off, because when it's nice spirits, it's like maybe it's the previous owner of the home, and they're probably like going back there because, great memories and all that. Or it could be chasing another kind of evil spirit. True, because sometimes a family can move into a house and they know. It's okay, guys. So, guys, that's my sister. If you heard her, plus two, just bad mojo alone, but that shouldn't make you want to not renovate a home. Like, obviously, what your beliefs are, do the precautions that you think is right for the spirits, and yeah.
People reported weird things happening. And the activity was happening everywhere, but there seems to be certain vaults that are like little hotspots. The first room I'm going to talk about is quite a nice room. We're starting off fairly positive. It's called the Cobbler's Room. And there's thought to be quite a friendly presence in this room. He's a shoemaker from the late 1700s, early 1800s time, so the time of legitimate businesses down in the vaults. And he's been known to actually manifest in the corner immediately to the right as you step in the doorway. He's described as being a short, stout man in his early 50s-ish, wearing a leather apron over a white shirt. And he'll be happily working away on a shoe while he's sitting on a bench. And people claim that the atmosphere is very welcoming, almost cheerful. And this shoemaker is seen as being so friendly, like very smiley. Just overall, this room is a nice place to be. He's also apparently been known to tug at people's laces, which makes sense as a shoemaker. And it's also worth pointing out that if you find that the vaults are getting a bit too much for you, the atmosphere everywhere else is just a bit too dark, you can go into the Cobbler's Room for a bit of a break, as it's said that this entity will kind of help protect you from the more malevolent spirits down there. And there are a lot down there. There might even be one in the Cobbler's Room itself, because yeah, this is a nice, friendly, inviting room, but in the corner to the left of the doorway, there is something a little less nice that might make its presence known. The entity manifests as a woman wearing what looks to be a black mourning dress with a black veil over her face, and she is completely distraught, inconsolable, and she's known to mostly affect women, particularly pregnant women, by giving them abdominal pains, which I can imagine is very disconcerting as a pregnant woman down in the vaults having cramps. There was one tour guide who, she was pregnant at the time, and all things considered, it was a very easy pregnancy, had no sickness really, other than 3 separate occasions. And each of these 3 separate occasions happened when she went into this room. She'd guide the group into this room, tell them the stories, all the while feeling more and more nauseous. And then she would be violently sick afterwards. But those were the only 3 times. Being in that room was the only common denominator during her pregnancy. There have been mediums who have made contact with this entity, and they think that this woman is grieving the loss of her only child. And all they can make out is that this child died in a horrific way, and that's why this woman is so distraught. Can you believe it? That's still the nicest room to find yourself in down in Edinburgh Vaults. Although the Wine Vault is known to have a fairly pleasant entity in it too though. It's thought to be the spirit of a young boy, maybe around 6 to 8 years old, somewhere in that region. He's got curly blonde hair and he's wearing a blue suit jacket with those baggy Knickerbocker style trousers and a white shirt. I think mediums must have got in contact with him too, as it said that his name is Jack, and it's thought that he works in the opium dens that would have been operating down there. Apparently he's most often seen peering out at tour groups from the lower shelves, and he likes to make his presence known to other children, which makes sense. Yeah. Women also say that they can feel a cold hand trying to hold theirs, and it seems like he's looking for some sort of maternal protection, as he apparently is absolutely terrified of the one very malevolent entity who I have a lot to say about later on. Little Jack is also another entity that is potentially looking out for you though, as guests have reported feeling a sharp tugging on their clothes, and mediums say that this happens when Jack is trying to warn you not to go into a certain area because that's where the big bad entity is. And so a lot of these vaults, they're fairly small sized rooms, not a lot of headroom, although there is one vault that is now double the height, and it's because at some point the ceiling in this particular vault collapsed and made 2 vaults, one basically double the height vault. And there's been a lot of weird things reported in this area. In 2005 5, there was a woman on a tour and she was absolutely adamant that she had just seen a flesh and blood person who looked exactly like Abraham Lincoln. I don't think it was the spirit of the 16th president of the United States, but it was probably a good representation of what this figure looked like, dressed in the fashions of the time of the 1800s. This woman said that she watched this figure for a few seconds before he turned and walked away towards the door. And there is another entity who's been spotted in this room, and it's that of a naked man. He seems to be floating in the upper section of the room. So
does this go like to get like to show people or what? Like I ain't, do what you want to do, man, but don't be showing me no like unclothed spirits. Keep that to your damn self.
So where the floor would have been. But it seems like the overwhelming consensus in this double height room is that the atmosphere is just totally off in here. Like the entities described, they just sound like some sort of residual echo. But the energy in this room seems to be actively negative for some reason. It also appears to really affect dogs if they're down in this room. They'll start barking, whimpering and crying, or they'll just anchor on and refuse to go in the room. And so then moving on, there's one room that I really need to mention. It's apparently called the Haunted Vault. I know, right? The Haunted Vault. As though this is the only vault with the ghost stories. But apparently when the vaults were initially opened up back in the 80s and 90s, the rooms that weren't taken over by businesses were actually used as band practice rooms, which makes sense. Solid stone walls, kind of underground, no one's going to hear you while you're working out the kinks. But there was this one particular vault that every single band hated. Any band that rented it out would always inevitably ask to be moved. Not only that, but within a few months of being rented out, it started to become so damp that it couldn't be used anyway. Which, yeah, a damp room and electricity for all your very expensive gear is probably not a good mix. It was getting so bad that this water was starting to affect the vaults around it too. It was spreading quite quickly. So they decided to stop renting the vault out completely, remove the wires, and basically just re-abandon that section for now. So it was super weird when as soon as they did that, the dampness immediately dried up and has been totally fine since then. Some sort of entity doesn't appreciate the live music, maybe? But now in this room, the Haunted Vault, it still seems to be affecting electronics in some way. If you're in here with a torch, it will likely be this vault where it will get dimmer and dimmer until it goes out. And then on one tour, there was a woman standing fairly near the back. The tour guide was doing their thing, telling them the stories, when all of a sudden, this woman starts screaming and pushes past everyone in between her and the doorway to get out. When she eventually calms down, she claims that she could feel hands all over her, touching her. Which, yeah, understandable reaction then, really. But if that's as bad as it gets in there, that is really a holiday compared to this next room. Because the Edinburgh Vaults, they do have this reputation of being overall very dark, quite an oppressive place to be, and a lot of that is to do with the entity in this room. I've seen this room be called the White Room, or just by the name of the entity who's most often seen in here, Mr. Boots' room. And Mr. Boots, he's been seen pretty much everywhere in the vaults. It seems like other than the cobbler's room, nowhere is really safe from him. He's described as being a very large, very tall, imposing man. He's wearing a dirty blue overcoat and a tricorn hat. Some people who claim to have witnessed him say that he sometimes holds a knife, and that they know that because the knife reflects the light on the emergency lighting that they've got down there. So that's a super cool little detail. But the worst part is that they say he has a completely pale face. Like, it's not flesh coloured, it's more white. And he has a huge, great big leering grin on his face. Which, coupled with the fact that anyone who witnesses him is just gripped with paralysing feelings of terror, makes the grin all that more scary. But that also, he has no eyes. Just black, where the eyes are supposed to be. He's also nicknamed the Watcher for two reasons. Number one, he is partial to lurking in the shadows behind tour groups and just watching you. But also number two, he apparently hates the name Mr. Boots. So much so that some tour guides will refuse to call him by his name while they're down there. Like, that's how afraid of this entity they are. They really don't want to get on the wrong side of him. There was actually a photograph taken down in the vaults, and it's not super clear, but when you brighten up the photo a bit, you can definitely see what looks to be a figure wearing a big overcoat, standing directly behind one of the visitors on this tour. In true pantomime, it's behind you fashion. Terrifying. But this entity appears to be a very powerful one, with so many different weird encounters being tied to him. He apparently messes with technology, causing batteries to drain, cameras to malfunction, lights to go out and all of that. Other times, visitors and tour guides will report an intense, dreadful feeling of being watched, feeling breathing down their necks, or even someone whispering in their ear, "Get out." And it's also thought to be this entity, Mr. Boots, who also attacks people down there, more often women. He pulls their hair and apparently has also scratched people before. And sometimes people will just claim that they can smell bad breath, whiskey, or even just the really strong stench of death. All of these smells are thought to mean that he is close by, very close. I tell you who else is close by. It's Lucy. Are you coming? Oh, hi. And there are so many different reports of people who have had absolutely terrifying encounters with this entity. It would have me clinging to the walls of the cobbler's room, honestly. There was one time when a tour was going on down in the vaults, and it was a very small tour group, literally just one married couple, that was it. And they were going through the vaults, obviously hearing the stories, when the wife freaks out, starts screaming and accusing the tour guide of hiring actors to jump out and scare the visitors. Neither the tour guide or the husband has a single clue what this woman is going on about. To them, there is absolutely no one else in the room with them. The wife goes on to describe a tall, imposing man with a large overcoat and tricorn hat, even picking up on all the little details like the wounds that the figure appears with, which aren't common knowledge. And so she's there describing this entity that has frightened her so bad. She's describing Mr. Boots, only they haven't got to that part of the tour yet. She has no idea who this person was. So that story is super weird. Even if this woman had done a little research before and knew about the overcoat and tricorn hat, the information on the wounds isn't online from what I can see. So that is pretty compelling. There was another story that really freaked me out when I read it, and again, it was someone on a tour down in the vaults. The visitor just so happened to start looking around as the tour guide was talking and noticed this pale face staring straight, dead on at her. She didn't recognise this as a person on the tour, and anyway, all of the rest of the visitors are listening to the tour guide. But this face, it was locked onto this visitor, and she described the face as being twisted with pure hatred. Like you could just feel the hatred oozing from this being. She couldn't look away, and the whole left side of her body completely froze. Completely numb, cold, couldn't move, couldn't look away from this face. Then something yanked at her left hand like a kid would if they wanted your attention. She managed to snap her gaze away from this hateful creature and look down, expecting to see a lost kid from the tour or something. There was absolutely nothing there. When she looked back up towards where the face was, it was gone. Was that maybe Jack, the little kid, saving the visitor from Mr. Boots? Maybe. Very interesting story. Creepy, but interesting. And so for a lot of the other main characters that appear to be haunting the vaults, we've got a little bit of an idea of who these people may have been in life. Admittedly through psychic mediums, which I know some people don't really believe in what they have to say, so it depends on how big your pinch of salt is with that one, I guess. But with Mr. Boots, or the Watcher, we really don't know. There have been a few theories thrown around. One theory says that he might have been a slum landlord terrorising the poor families who had no choice but to live down in the vaults. Others think he might be a body snatcher looking for his next cadaver, or just any sort of criminal trying to hide what he's done or protect his stash or something, and that's why he's so territorial. Or then, was he hired by other criminals or even a legitimate business to look after their goods? Because there wouldn't have been this overnight switch from the vaults being an okay place to be for legitimate businesses to store their stock into a seedy underground criminal haven. The criminals would have been gradually moving in while the businesses moved out of the storerooms. Was it that one particular business hired this terrifying guy to scare off any potential threats to his boss's stock? Kind of like a night watchman for a wine merchant storeroom or something. And then maybe a gang of criminals who were moving into the vaults at the time took him on and killed him down there. I'm just spitballing here, like just trying to think of possibilities. Because yeah, they're called vaults, but we're not talking secure, locked up bank vaults here. A lot of the time, you'd have to walk through your neighbour's storeroom to get to your own. So it makes sense to hire a dedicated watchman to guard your property. Just something to think about. Because while there are one or two friendly spirits down in the vaults that can save you from the more negative energy down there really is nowhere to hide where the Watcher can't eventually find you. So what do you think? Edinburgh vaults, haunted or just super atmospheric from the pitch blackness and the history? I absolutely believe that these vaults are haunted. There are just too many stories of too many different visitors coming weeks, months, years apart who have no connection to each other, experiencing weirdly similar things, all the way back from the 90s as well. And I know that regular quote-unquote ghost sightings are good for business for the tours and for people going on these tours who want to see a ghost. I just think that for all the misery and suffering that these walls have seen over the last 200 years, specifically during the time when it was basically a criminal free-for-all, housing only the most destitute and also the members of society who don't want their activities to be seen by anyone, specifically the law, probably countless deaths occurred that were never recorded. It makes sense from a historical point of view to be haunted, and then added in the terrifying witness stories that people are claiming even to this day on these tours. It does make sense. And there was a lot more I could have said on the Edinburgh vaults. There were a few vaults I didn't even talk about. I covered the main stories today, so don't worry, you've not not missed out. But if you want me to come back and do some of the other vaults and some more creepy stories, then just let me know. And maybe if you've got a terrifying encounter in the vaults that you want to share, I might include it too. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please tell me just how much by pressing the like button, and make sure you're subscribed. There's more stories coming at you every single week like this, and I am currently working flat out every single day to pull off something incredibly ambitious a bit later on this year, which is going to be epic if I can pull it off. So you might want to be subscribed in case you want to find out what it is. But all that aside, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. It's been a while since you've...
Okay guys, that was another great video from Don't Scare Claire. I do believe that the vaults are haunted. There's too much ghost sightings and stories been told by people. If you've been to these vaults, please let me know if you had any experiences, ghostly or strange, down in the comment section down below. And I will also leave a link to Don't Scare Claire and her YouTube YouTube channel, and also the link to this video. Okay guys, please give this video please like, comment and share this video. And guys, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel. And I would like to thank everybody who has subscribed to me recently. It means a lot to me. I am really doing my best with this, and I would like to make like a nice, safe community if we can talk about horror movies and stuff, and maybe things related to the videos. Okay guys, until next time, bye.